Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back in our discussion today. I will explain about equivalence and equivalent effect. In this chapter, has examined important question of translation by linguistics in the 1950 and 1960. The key terms are meaning and equivalence. This was discussed by Roman Jacobson in 1969 and critically developed by Nida. Translation equivalent is an important concept of translation theory. It is one of the main principles of Western theory of translation. Finding translation equivalent is one of the core problems of the translation process. The concept of equivalent is used to distinguish between free translation and literal translation. This term was first used by Roman Jacobson in 1969, only then was used by experts with various attempts to distinguish the concept. Some scholars view translation as a more linguistic process in which ideas from one language are translated into another. In translation theory, the term equivalent is used in its general sense because it's difficult to find completely identical words and meaning in different language. And then different language have a different phonetic, grammatical, syntaxes, and vocabulary structure. That's why we can only talk about a certain degree of quality when we make translation. We use the term equivalent in the sense similarity or approach, and it indicates the degree of or of similarity between the source text and the target text. This similarity can be achieved at different level. Translation is a form of communication, and that is why it is so important to establish equality between the source text and the target text. And then Oman Jacobson distinguished three kinds of translation, which include the first is interlingual, and the second is interlingual, and the third is intersemiotic. Interlingual is dealing with one language, and interlingual is dealing with two language, and intersemiotic is dealing with science system. According to Jacobson, translators look for synonym when making interlingual translation to convey message. And the next is Nida and the science of translating. Nida attempts to move translation, Bible translation in his case, into a more scientific era by incorporating recent work in linguistics. Nida's more systematic approach borrows theoretical concept and terminology both from semantic and pragmatics and from Noam Chomsky's work on syntactic structure, which form the theory of generative transformational grammar. Nida adaptation of transformational grammar model and scientific method to analyze meaning in his work on Bible translating. And then is the influence of Chomsky. Chomsky's generative transformational model analyzes sentence into a series of related level, governed by rules. The key feature of this model can be summarized as follows. The first is past structured will generate an underlying or deep structured ways. The second is transformed by transformational rules relating one underlying structure to another. Example is active to passive, to produce. And the third is a final surface structure with it, y itself is subject to phonological and morphemic rules. And then the most basic of such structure are cardinal sentences, which are simple, active, declarative sentences that require the minimum of transformation. Neither incorporates key features of Chomsky's model into his science of translation. In particular, Nida says that it provides the translator with a technique for decoding the search text and a procedure for encoding the target text. Although he refers Chomsky's model when analyzing the search text. NIDA's three-stage system of translation are analysis, transport, and restructuring. And then kernel is a key term in this model. Just as kernel sentence was the most basic structure of Chomsky's initial model, so for NIDA and double kernel are the basic structural element out of his language builds its elaborate superstructure. Kernel are the level at which the message is transferred into the repertoire language before being transformed into the surface structure in three stages: literal transfer, minimal transfer, and literally transfer. And the next is formal and dynamic equivalence and the principle of equivalent effect. The old terms such as literal, free, and faithful translation are discarded by NIDA in favor of two basic orientation or types of equivalence. The first is formal equivalence and the second is dynamic equivalence. These are defined by NIDA as follows. The first is formal equivalence. Formal equivalence focuses attention on the message itself, its both form and content. One is concerned that the message in the receptor language should map as closely as possible the different element in the source language. Formal equivalent or formal correspondent is currently oriented toward the source text structure, which exerts strong influence in determining accuracy and correctness. Most typical of this kind of translation are close translation, with, with a close approximation to such text structure, often with scholarly footnotes allowing the student, since this type of translation will often be used in an academic environment, to gain close access to the language and custom of the search culture. And the second is dynamic equivalent. Dynamic or functional equivalent is based on what Nida calls the principle of equivalent effect, what the relationship between receptor and message should be substantially the same as that which existed between the original receptor and the message. The message has to be tailored to the receptor linguistic need and cultural expectation and aims at complete naturalness of expression. Naturalness is a key requirement for NIDA. Indeed, he defines the goal of dynamic equivalent as seeking the closest natural equivalent to the source language message. And then as for NIDA, the success of the translation depends above all on achieving equivalent response. It is one of the four basic requirements of translation, which are the first is making sense, and the second is conveying the spirit and manner of the tongue of the original, and the third is having a natural and easy form of expression, and the fourth is producing a similar response. As a general rule for the conflict between the traditional notion of content and form, neither underlines that correspondent in meaning must have priority over correspondent in style if equivalent effect is to be achieved. And the conclusion of this material is equivalent is a complex term which describes phenomena from different spheres of human knowledge. In the field of translation, it was appeared in the middle of the last century, and since then has become an important indicator of the translation process. Most translation theorists and researchers pay attention to the equivalence in translation, despite that, despite the fact that their opinion on his phenomenon may differ. Some specialists believe that the equivalent may be regarded as a synonym of the translation process. Others believe that the equivalent should not cause the loss of main message of the text. Despite given approach, the equivalent is an important notion in the translation process, and it helps to approach the meaning and value of the translation process in general. I think enough for me. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.